New Orleans played music because it was afraid. On the night the letter named, the city did not wait for midnight in silence. Pianos were opened in parlors. Cornets and clarinets came out of their cases. Cafes stayed crowded. Dance halls filled until people stood shoulder to shoulder, not only to dance, but to be near sound. In some homes, the music must have been good. In others, it was only a frightened family making noise because quiet felt dangerous. The date was March 19, 1919. 3 days earlier, the Times-Picayune had printed a letter from someone claiming to be the Axeman. The writer said he would pass over New Orleans at 15 minutes after midnight and take another victim. Then came the line that made the city obey. He said he was fond of jazz, and any home with a jazz band playing would be spared. No one knew whether the letter was real. It did not need to prove itself before it changed the night. It moved from ink to breakfast tables, from streetcars to saloons, from barbershops to kitchen rooms, until a song began to feel like a lock on a door. No attack was reported that night. That is the part people remember because it sounds almost unreal. A killer, a letter, a city playing jazz to stay alive. But the man behind the name did not begin with music. He began with wood, back doors, thin panels, kitchen entrances, small cuts in the edge of an ordinary house. The quieter evidence has no brass section behind it. It is a piece of a door damaged in the dark, a grocery family asleep behind the shop, and someone outside with enough patience to open a path in. Before the letter, before the sheet music written to cash in on the fear, before the Axeman became a character in New Orleans folklore, there were small groceries. Many were run by Italian and Sicilian families who lived close to their work. A store counter by day could sit only a wall or a curtain away from a sleeping room at night. A back door might lead from an alley into a storeroom, then into the private part of a family's life. In those shops, the city bought bread, fruit, oil, tobacco, cheese, and credit. Customers knew the grocer. The grocer knew who came late, who lingered, who paid, who watched too closely. By closing time, the same space changed character without changing its walls. A scale on the counter, a ledger with unpaid accounts. Sacks of flour, fruit crates, and a rear latch all stayed where they were, while the family tried to sleep a few steps away. A stranger did not have to invade a distant household. He could enter a business he may have already studied in daylight. Then, cross from commerce into the room where the grocer had put down his work and become simply a husband, a wife or a child asleep behind the shop. The attacks grew from that closeness. The killer did not need a hidden mansion or a deserted road. He moved against places where business and family shared the same address. If he came as a customer, he could learn a layout without looking suspicious. If he came as a burglar, he could test a door after midnight. If he left without taking much, police had to ask whether robbery had ever been the point. The police often began with the explanation New Orleans already knew how to say. In Italian and Sicilian neighborhoods, a killing could be pushed toward Black Hand, mafia, vendetta, or extortion before the wood around the rear door had been studied closely enough. Those words had real history in the city, but they also made some officers look sideways at neighbors, while the physical scene was pointing downward at a broken panel, a household tool, and money that did not always leave with the attacker. So the first hours of several investigations moved in two directions at once. Detectives questioned relatives, former employees, rivals, workers, and people already marked by prejudice. At the same time, the rooms kept giving them a plainer problem. Someone could reach the private quarters of small groceries, often through the rear, often at night, often without taking enough to explain the risk. The case kept asking for a man who understood doors better than headlines. The first attack in the famous 1918 wave struck the Maggio household. Joseph Maggio was an Italian grocer. He and his wife, Catherine, were attacked while they slept in late May 1918. The weapon pattern was strange from the beginning. A razor and an axe or axe-like tool, one sharp and one heavy. Both Joseph and Catherine died. Joseph survived only long enough, after discovery, to leave investigators with the awful nearness of a witness who almost returned from the room. The scene gave police objects before it gave them a man. Reports describe clothing left behind, as if the attacker had changed before fleeing. The razor was later found outside, on neighboring property, after the first search had missed it. Those pieces suggested movement after the attack, time spent solving practical problems, and a killer who did not run in the simple panic of a botched robbery. Joseph's brothers, Jake and Andrew Maggio, were tied to the discovery, and Andrew was pulled into suspicion early. He was close to the family world, close to the scene, and near enough for police to ask hard questions. Officers could measure his access, ask about his movements, and look for the ordinary family tensions that sometimes sit behind a violent room. Then the lead thinned. Discovery did not become proof. Proximity did not place him behind the door with the weapon. The first named suspect slipped away, and the city was left with a dead couple, a strange sequence, and no safe explanation. What remained were the things Andrew could not explain away and could not be convicted on. The razor outside, the clothing left behind, the weapon mix, and the sense that the attacker had crossed from room to room with purpose. In the Maggio apartment, investigators had to study more than violence. Someone had entered, attacked, moved through rooms, dealt with clothing, left a razor outside, and disappeared into a neighborhood that woke up with no name to give back. Domestic trouble could be followed through family quarrels. Robbery could be measured by what was missing. The Maggio scene crossed those categories and belonged fully to none of them. The small procedural failures mattered from the start. A first search missed the razor, later found outside, and the blood-stained clothing raised questions that could not be answered cleanly once the scene had already begun passing through too many hands and too many stories. Detectives took statements, compared alibis, questioned family members, and read the room for motive. But the room had already begun changing under human hands, and every new story made it harder to know which detail came from the scene and which detail came from the crowd around it. A month later, another grocery became the center of the file. Louis Bessumer and Harriet Lowe were attacked in living quarters behind Bessumer's grocery at Dorgenois and La Harpe. A bakery wagon driver, John Zonka, came for a routine delivery and found the couple badly injured. The weapon, a hatchet, was said to belong to Bessumer and was found nearby. Again, the attacker had used the victim's own place against him. Morning work had already started. A man came to deliver bread, the kind of errand that should have ended with a door opening, a few words at the counter, and another stop on the route. Instead, the delivery carried the crime out of the back room and into the street. The Axeman pattern kept using those ordinary hinges. A grocer's hour, a delivery route, a customer entrance, a bedroom close enough to commerce that the next business call might discover what happened in the night. Police arrested Louis Ubicon, an African-American man who had worked at the grocery. The evidence did not hold, and he was released. The city had a name for a moment, then lost it. That would happen again and again. An arrest, a rumor of certainty, a headline that seemed to tighten the noose. Then the case opening back up because the proof was too weak. Harriet Lowe's later statements made the Bessumer case even harder to keep straight. Once, She described the attacker in ways police questioned because of her condition, then accused Bessumer himself. Foreign language letters in Bessumer's possession fed wartime suspicion. In a city already nervous about immigrants, war, secret societies, and neighborhood scandal, Bessumer became a suspect inside his own attack. He was arrested, released, arrested again after Lowe's accusation, and finally acquitted after a short jury deliberation. By then, the investigation had already begun to lose its center. Ubicon's arrest brought race into the file. Bessumer's letters brought war suspicion. Lowe's accusation brought intimacy and scandal. Each path gave people something to talk about, but none answered the smaller, colder question. Who had entered those grocery quarters with a hatchet? And why had so little been taken? The Bessumer file also shows how quickly the Axeman cases could split apart under pressure. One lead pulled toward an employee, another pulled toward the injured grocer himself, another pulled toward foreign words on paper in a wartime city already trained to fear spies. By the time a jury cleared Bessumer, the attack had produced plenty of suspicion and almost no clean direction. What remained steady was the object in the room, the hatchet, the rear quarters, the sign that someone had used Bessumer's own place against him. The city tightened around its doors. Men checked back entrances before sleeping. Families who had once trusted the ordinary noises of alleyways began listening for them. A late knock became something to measure. A loose panel meant more than bad carpentry. Some households kept weapons close. Others sat awake longer than they admitted, waiting for the ordinary city to settle into the uneasy hours when a rear yard, a delivery gate, or a dark kitchen window could begin to feel exposed. The fear did not yet have the full power of the jazz letter, but it was already learning where to live, in the small wooden spaces between public shop and private bed. That is where the snowball began to roll. One family checked a latch, then another. One shopkeeper looked longer at the rear entrance, then a neighbor asked whether his own panel could be cut the same way. Men who had spent the day weighing produce or slicing meat tried to stay awake after closing. Mothers listened for children turning in the next room. Fear was still private then, moving from one rear door to the next in smaller, quieter ways. In August 1918, Anna Schneider was attacked in her home. She was pregnant at the time and survived. 2 days later, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Her case is often placed near the Axeman pattern, though it differs from the strongest grocery-linked attacks. Reports do not give it the same clean door panel signature, and the weapon detail is less settled. That uncertainty did not calm the city. It widened the fear. If Schneider belonged to the pattern, then the attacker was moving beyond the core grocery world. If she did not, then New Orleans had become so frightened that any nighttime attack could be pulled toward the Axeman's shadow. Either way, people were beginning to hear the same name whenever a house was entered after dark. 5 days later, Joseph Romano was attacked. Romano was an older man, a barber connected through relatives to a small grocery. His nieces, Pauline and Mary Bruno, heard the disturbance and saw enough of the fleeing attacker to give police a living glimpse. A man in dark clothing and a slouched hat. Romano was severely injured and died afterward. Investigators found an axe in the yard. The back door bore the familiar sign of forced entry through a panel. A description moved through the city, and for a short time the killer felt almost visible. Dark clothing, slouched hat, a hurried figure going out the back. The trouble was that New Orleans contained many men who could disappear inside that outline. A hat could be changed, work clothes could be ordinary, and a man seen only in flight could become a dozen different men by the time the story crossed a block. The glimpse left police with an outline that could not be arrested. The door panel became more important with every scene. The attacker was not simply smashing his way in. He seemed to work at small sections of wood, often at rear entrances, creating narrow openings where a person could slip through or reach a lock. In some accounts, a railroad shoe pin or similar tool became part of the method. That detail made officers think of someone practical, someone who understood burglary, someone who could work quietly enough that a sleeping household remained until it was too late. By then, the newspapers had given him the name that would outlive every suspect, the Axeman. A name like that can steady public fear by giving it one shape. It can also make separate facts blur together. The name made a scattered set of crimes sound like the work of one figure before every scene had been sorted. The public could imagine a monster. Police still had to decide which attacks truly belonged together and which only shared the same dread. Patrols increased. Reporters pressed for updates. Families added locks, watched yards, and listened for the faint scrape of wood. Men who had worked long hours behind counters began sleeping lightly. Women who had handled customers all day now had to wonder which regular face had noticed the back room. Children were kept closer. Some shopkeepers looked at the rear entrance before they looked at the cash drawer. Some families did the old arithmetic of fear. Which room was nearest the alley? Which door had the weakest panel? Which neighbor would hear a shout? By then, a sound at the rear of a house could make a family sit upright in bed. The newspapers helped build that pressure with each new article. They needed names, patterns, and warnings. A phrase printed in the morning could become a rumor by afternoon, and a near fact by evening. Once the Axeman name began to harden, each later attack had to fight its way through expectation before investigators could decide whether it truly belonged. Then March 1919 brought the Cortamigia attack in Gretna, across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. Charles and Rosie Cortamigia lived above or near their grocery with their young daughter, Mary. The attacker entered during the night. Charles and Rosie survived. Mary did not. The weapon was again a household or scene-adjacent tool, and the crime seemed close enough to the Axeman pattern that the name crossed the river with it. The Cortamigia case gave authorities something they had rarely had, a living survivor who could name someone. Gretna also changed the geography of the fear. The attacks were no longer only a New Orleans police problem inside the city's familiar map. Across the river, another grocery family had been reached in the same sleeping hours. The Mississippi did not make the pattern feel safer. It made the offender seem able to cross the boundaries that citizens used to organize their own sense of safety. Across the street lived Orlando Giordano and his son Frank, rival grocers who had been involved in a business dispute with the Cortamiglias. Orlando was elderly and in poor health. Frank's size made the narrow entry point itself a problem for the accusation. Still, Gretna officials focused on them. A business quarrel could be put in front of a jury more easily than a faceless night intruder. It gave the attack a beginning before midnight, and a motive people could repeat. Rosie Cortamigia, recovering from terrible injuries, signed an affidavit accusing the Giordanos. The case snapped shut too quickly. Orlando and Frank Giordano were convicted. Orlando received life imprisonment. Frank was sentenced to hang. For a city desperate to stop the Axeman, that verdict looked like a door finally closing. It gave the public names, motive, neighbors, a courtroom, and punishment. It turned a night intruder into a local feud that could be understood and filed away. Then, Rosie Cortamigia walked into a newspaper office 9 months later and took it back. She said she had not seen the attackers and had been pressured into naming the Giordanos. The prosecution resisted her recantation. and the threat of perjury hung over the changed statement. But the conviction could not keep standing on such a broken foundation. In December 1920, the Giordanos were released. The paper record around that reversal is colder than any legend. A statement had put 2 men in prison, one under a death sentence. A later statement pulled the floor out from under the verdict. Nothing about signed that process brought Mary Cortimiglia back, and nothing about it identified the person who had entered the house. The machinery of justice had moved loudly and officially, then had to admit it had not reached the man the city was trying to find. The near answer left damage on both sides. A child was dead. 2 wounded parents had lived through the attack and the machinery that followed it. 2 men had been pushed to the edge of permanent ruin, one of them toward the gallows, on testimony that later collapsed. The Axeman file did not become cleaner after Gretna. It became more dangerous. After the Cortimiglia attack, the letter arrived. On March 16, 1919, the Times-Picayune printed a message from a writer who claimed to be the Axeman. The voice of the letter was theatrical, mocking, and more interested in control than in explanation. It claimed the writer had never been caught and never would be. It threatened a new attack at 12:15 a.m. on March 19. Then it gave the city its bargain: play jazz and be spared. New Orleans did not treat the letter as a joke. Restaurants, cafes, and dance halls prepared for crowds. Musicians found work. Sheet music for the mysterious Axeman's jazz appeared, turning fear into commerce almost before the ink had dried. In homes, families who could play, played. Families who could not may have gone somewhere they could hear a band. The letter had crossed from a police problem into the business of the whole city. Owners advertised music, neighbors asked where bands would be, and people, who might have laughed at the threat in daylight, still had to decide what to do when the clock moved toward midnight. For one strange night, the city took part in a public ritual built from terror, rhythm, and uncertainty. The famous image is almost festive if it is separated from the file. A whole city giving itself over to jazz. Inside the evidence, it looks different. The music did not mean people were brave. It meant they believed, or half believed, that a man with an axe might be listening at the edge of midnight. The commercial turn came almost immediately. Joseph John de Villa's sheet music. The mysterious Axeman's jazz. Put the killer's name on a piano bench while families were still deciding whether music could protect a room. That piece of paper has become one of the case's strangest artifacts. It may have been only an opportunistic song, written in a frightened city. Some later researchers have wondered whether the letter and the song were closer to each other than the public knew. The evidence has never made that suspicion firm. But the timing is hard to ignore. No attack was reported that night. The letter gained power from that silence. If the writer was the killer, he had made the city perform and then kept his promise. If the writer was a hoaxer, he had borrowed murder and turned it into theater. If the letter was part of publicity around the song, then New Orleans had been manipulated by someone who understood how fear, newspapers, and music could feed one another. The paper did not settle which version was true. It only preserved the sound of the city obeying. For investigators, the jazz night created a problem that lasted longer than the music. The letter was the loudest clue and the least dependable one. Its language was theatrical enough to sound like a hoax, specific enough to frighten a city, and successful enough to make its author powerful for a night. After March 19, every later telling of the Axeman had to decide whether to follow that paper or return to the doors. The attacks did not end with the jazz night. In August 1919, Steve Boca was attacked after returning home. He survived and managed to seek help, but he could not give police the clear face they needed. His case carried familiar elements: the nighttime entry, the sudden blow, the victim alive enough to leave the room, but not enough to close the file. He could bring the emergency into daylight. He could not bring the attacker with it. That became one of the recurring cruelties of the series. Survivors existed, but their survival did not always create usable identification. A person waking into violence could remember motion, clothing, size, a fleeing shape, or the direction of a door. The law needed a name, a face, an object tied to a hand. The Axeman scenes kept giving it fragments. In September, Sarah Lawman was attacked in her apartment. She survived, but her memory of the assailant did not give investigators a usable identity. A weapon was found outside. Her case is often listed among the Axeman attacks, though the connection is less secure than the strongest is grocery-linked scene. By then, the name had grown large enough to gather crimes that might once have been treated separately. The later attacks did not produce the same single clean narrative that folklore prefers. Boca survived but did not identify the man. Lawman survived but could not give the law a face. Each survival should have made the investigation stronger. Instead, it exposed the same weakness from another angle. The attacker could leave people alive and still remain indistinct, a moving figure seen too late and too briefly. The final commonly cited New Orleans killing was Mike Pepitone in October 1919. Pepitone was attacked in his bedroom. His wife, Esther, saw a large man fleeing with an axe. The case has long been attached to the Axeman story, but it sits uneasily in the file. Some researchers argue it was more likely tied to a personal vendetta. Others keep it in the series because the weapon, the night setting, and the city's memory point back to the same fear. Pepitone's death later produced one of the most dramatic suspect trails. In 1921, in Los Angeles, Esther Pepitone, then remarried under the name Esther Albano, shot and killed Joseph Manfrey, also reported under names such as Mumfrey or Monfrey. She said he had threatened her and claimed to have killed her husband. Manfrey had a criminal background, and his name has remained in Axeman discussions for decades. His book opens easily. A widow connected him to her husband's death. He had the kind of record that made worse things seem possible. The Pepitone case gives the theory a vivid shape: a threat, a claimed confession, a shooting far from New Orleans. Then the bridge back to the earlier attacks begins to fail. Manfrey was not physically tied to the Maggio apartment, the Bessumer grocery, the Romano door, or the Cortamilia house. The Pepitone murder may not belong cleanly with the Axeman pattern at all. Esther's account came in the context of her own defense after she killed him. Manfrey almost gives the legend an ending. He does not give the investigation enough to close. The same pattern follows the other suspects. Maggio was close to the first major scene, but discovery did not become guilt. Louis Ubicon was arrested after the Bessumer Lowell attack, then released when weak evidence failed. Louis Bessumer himself was dragged under suspicion through foreign language letters and Harriet Lowe's accusations, then acquitted. The Giordanos were convicted after Rosie Cortamilia's statement, then freed after her recantation, exposed the foundation beneath the verdict. Manfrey entered through Pepitone and a later killing in Los Angeles, but his line back to the core series is uncertain. Each name opens one door and leaves three others locked. A suspect might explain a single attack, but not the pattern. A local feud might explain Gretna, but not the Maggio apartment. A criminal record might make Manfrey plausible in Pepitone, but not at Dorgenois and La Harpe. A worker near a grocery might explain access, but not the letter. A black hand theory might satisfy old prejudice, but fail against the untouched money and repeated door method. The strongest profile may never have had a name in the newspapers. The attacker seems to have understood back doors, small panels, nighttime entry, and the mixed geography of store and home. He may have been a burglar, a workingman, a customer, or someone who could pass through Italian grocery neighborhoods without standing out. He often used or found tools already at the scene. He did not need the theatrical letter to be dangerous. He needed patience and a city whose houses gave him wood to work on. That kind of suspect was hard for early 20th century policing to hold. He might not have been a family enemy. He might not have belonged to one grocery dispute. He might not have left with stolen goods. If he worked odd jobs, moved through neighborhoods, or used streetcars and rail lines, then witnesses could see him without remembering him. He would be one more man in work clothes, one more customer, one more figure, passing a back fence after dark. A modern case might try to build that person from fibers, prints, blood typing, travel records, offender behavior, or links between jurisdictions. The old file had a different toolkit: neighbors' memories, injured survivors, newspaper appeals, police interviews, and the hope that one suspect would bring all the scenes into alignment. When that did not happen, the pattern itself became evidence and argument at the same time. The earlier Cleaver attacks from 1910 and 1911 complicate the picture. Some researchers see them as part of the same hand. Others treat them as separate, similar crimes, later pulled under the Axeman name. The argument has weight because the older attacks also involved Italian grocers, night entries, and brutal household violence. It also has danger because similarity is not identity. A method can echo without proving one offender. A newspaper can make old cases look newly connected once a famous name exists. Later Louisiana attacks on Italian grocers create the same problem in the other direction. The pattern expands, then weakens. The more crimes added to the list, the more room there is for coincidence, newspaper shaping, and fear doing the work evidence should do. A narrow case may miss the real offender. A swollen case may invent one. New Orleans had a real series of attacks. It also had a legend growing around them while the attacks were still fresh. That legend helped the killer by making him larger than the evidence. Once the city knew about axes, door panels, Italian grocers, and the jazz letter, every witness statement had to be weighed against what anyone could have read over breakfast. A man could confess from imagination. A frightened neighbor could reshape a memory. A newspaper could make one attack sound more like another before police had finished separating them. The police were working inside the limits of the time. There was no DNA database, no modern scene preservation, no digital trail, no easy way to compare distant patterns across jurisdictions. Witnesses were injured, frightened, pressured, or uncertain. Some officers recognized the repeated method. Others reached for familiar prejudices. A case that needed clean physical evidence kept producing contaminated certainty. The paperwork could preserve dates, addresses, injuries, arrests, and verdicts. It could record a slouched hat, a rear panel, a hatchet found nearby, a statement taken back, or a survivor who could not swear to a face. What it could not do was make those pieces line up across every scene. The file kept gathering objects, but the objects did not all point with the same force. The March 1919 letter remains the loudest artifact because it gave the city a story it could hear. The broken door panel is quieter and colder. The letter tells us about publicity, fear, performance, and possibly ego. The panel tells us about entry. Someone worked at the rear of a house. Someone made a small opening. Someone, chose places where people slept near their shops. Someone often used a tool from the house itself. Those facts do not sing, but they carry the investigation better than the jazz does. The jazz night made the Axeman immortal. The door panel made him real. By the time the attacks faded from New Orleans, the city had already begun turning the killer into folklore. He became a tour story, a song title, a figure standing at the edge of jazz history, with an axe in one hand and a letter in the other. The older record is smaller and harder to romanticize. Joseph and Catherine Maggio in their grocery world. Louis Bessumer and Harriet Lowe behind another shop. Anna Schneider, surviving. Joseph Romano's nieces seeing a fleeing figure. The Cortimiglia child who did not survive. The Giordano's almost destroyed by a false certainty. Steve Boca and Sarah. Lawman carrying wounds after the headlines moved on. Mike Pepitone, sitting uneasily at the edge of the pattern. The case remains unsolved for reasons that are plain on paper and painful in sequence. The scenes were fragile. The pattern itself was disputed. Some attacks may have been included because the city was already terrified. Ethnic and racial prejudice pushed officials toward Black Hand, Mafia, vendetta, or weak outsider suspects before the physical evidence was strong enough. The letter may not have come from the killer. The best suspects either depended on bad testimony, failed to connect across scenes, or belonged to attacks that may not be part of the same series. A final answer would need something the old file has never produced. A reliable physical link, a confession with private knowledge that could not have been copied from newspapers, or a suspect who fits the Maggio, Bessumer, Romano, Cortimiglia, Boca, Laumann, and possibly Pepitone evidence without breaking somewhere. It would also need a way to sort the true series from the shadow around it. Which attacks belong, which were borrowed by panic, and which were forced into one story because the city needed one enemy, more than it needed uncertainty. That last task may be the hardest. If the series is too narrow, the real offender may slip out through an excluded attack. If the series is too wide, one man becomes a container for unrelated crimes, bad arrests, and newspaper fear. The Axeman file has always balanced on that edge. It has enough repeated details to feel connected, and enough broken links to make certainty dangerous. Instead, the case keeps returning to two objects. One is the letter that made New Orleans play. It is loud, theatrical, quotable, and easy to remember. It turns fear into a scene people can picture. A city lit late, bands playing, families listening for both music and footsteps. The other is the damaged door. It is plain, physical, and harder to romanticize. It does not ask for applause. It asks who cut, who slipped through it, who knew it was there, and why the same kind of entrance kept appearing while the city searched everywhere else for a face. The letter is why people still tell the story. The door is why the story is still a case. The legend listens to the music. The case keeps looking at the door.